The dark days of World War II not only ravaged the world but also gave birth to one of history's most notorious monsters. Shaped by the harsh realities and traumas of wartime, Andrei Chikatilo emerged as a figure of unspeakable horror. His ghastly crimes would cast a long shadow over the Soviet Union, leaving an indelible mark on its history and psyche. Born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yablukny, Sumy Oblast, Andrei Chikatilo was born into a world profoundly affected by the brutal Stalinist regime. His parents, collective farmers, lived in a cramped one-room house, struggling to survive under harsh conditions. Although they were not compensated for their labor, they were permitted to cultivate a small plot of land behind their home. This small allowance was a meager consolation in a region still reeling from the catastrophic Holodomor, a man-made famine inflicted by Joseph Stalin. During this dark period, farmers were forced to surrender all their food production, leading to widespread starvation and immense suffering. Chikatilo's formative years were thus marked by relentless hardship, an atmosphere of fear, and the scarcity that defined Soviet Ukraine's turbulent era. Despite being farmers, Chikatilo's family was perpetually short of food. The Communist Party routinely confiscated their entire harvest, leaving them with nothing but grass and leaves to stave off their hunger. Andrei's first taste of bread came at the age of 12, a rare luxury amidst their constant scarcity. This relentless deprivation and the daily humiliation of their struggle deeply scarred his childhood, creating an environment of fear and want that profoundly shaped his early years. The harsh realities of his upbringing forged a foundation of insecurity and suffering that would have lasting effects on his psyche. The famine orchestrated by Stalin before World War II left a deep scar on the entire population, not just on Andrei Chikatilo. The dire conditions drove many to extreme measures, including acts of cannibalism. Amidst this harrowing environment, Andrei's mother, Anna, told him a disturbing story that he had a brother named Stefan who was abducted and cannibalized by their neighbors. Whether Stefan was real or simply a tale invented to frighten Andrei into being cautious remains unknown. Regardless, this chilling story, coupled with the pervasive fear and scarcity of the time, profoundly affected Andrei's psyche. The story not only heightened his feelings of insecurity, but also deepened his trauma, leaving a lasting imprint on his early years and shaping his emotional landscape in those dark days. He had a deep affection for his father, Roman, but was tragically separated from him when Roman was drafted into the Red Army as the Soviet Union entered World War II. Left behind with his mother, Andrei had to share the only bed in their small, cramped home. The absence of his father, combined with the severe conditions of wartime life, caused significant emotional distress. Andrei began to wet the bed at night, a sign of his deep-seated anxiety and fear. His mother, already overwhelmed by their circumstances, responded with harsh scolding and punishment each time it happened. This severe reaction only intensified Andrei's psychological turmoil, deepening his sense of isolation and inadequacy. The combination of trauma and neglect left lasting scars on his young psyche, profoundly affecting his troubled childhood. While Roman was fighting on the front lines during World War II, Anna gave birth to a daughter named Tatiana. With the war raging on and no chance of leave, Roman could not be with his family. Amid the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, it is believed that Anna was raped by one or more German soldiers, resulting in her pregnancy. Given that their home had only one bedroom and one bed, it is possible that this traumatic event occurred in the presence of young Andrei Chikatilo. Witnessing such a distressing incident would have further compounded the emotional trauma from his already harsh and deprived childhood. The combination of his father's absence, the brutal wartime conditions, and the potential trauma of this event likely had a profound and lasting impact on Andrei's psychological development. Chikatilo experienced the overwhelming pressure of the Nazi occupation and was a direct witness to the horrors of war, including relentless bombings, gunfire, and widespread violence. He and his mother sought refuge in cellars and makeshift trenches dug by soldiers to escape the constant attacks. The chaos and destruction of their surroundings left a profound impact on him. Ultimately, their home was consumed by fire, compounding the trauma and hardship they endured. The relentless strife and devastation of this period left a deep imprint on young Andrei Chikatilo, significantly influencing his psychological development during these crucial years. Amidst the brutalities of Stalin's regime and the ceaseless horrors of the war, Chikatilo's psyche was profoundly and permanently scarred. The continuous exposure to violence, deprivation, and trauma during his early years left enduring psychological scars that would shape his troubled future. The Red Army was notoriously harsh towards its soldiers. Among the brutal tactics employed was the firing line system. Soldiers who attempted to retreat or desert were shot by special units designated to enforce discipline. These units stayed behind the front lines to ensure that troops advanced as ordered, leaving no room for deviation. Any soldier caught trying to retreat faced execution by a smear squad. This extreme measure was a stark reflection of the relentless pressure and strict discipline imposed by the Red Army. Despite this, Roman, Chikatilo's father, was wounded in battle and captured, bringing significant shame to both himself and his family. Under the Stalinist regime, there were only two outcomes: victory or death, with desertion met with execution. Being captured and perceived as having avoided both the dangerous battlefield and the firing line only intensified the dishonor. This view portrayed him as an even greater coward who not only failed to achieve victory but also evaded both the war and the threat of death by being far from the front lines. Later, Roman was released in a prisoner exchange and returned home, but his fate only worsened. Under the Stalinist regime, the image of the Soviet soldier was one of unwavering bravery, and those who fell into enemy hands, regardless of the circumstances, were deemed to have failed in their duty. The regime viewed captured soldiers as weak and cowardly, often suspecting them of treachery. Returning prisoners of war were scrutinized under a harsh regime that demanded loyalty and resilience. They were subjected to rigorous evaluations to determine whether they had collaborated with the enemy. Many of these individuals faced additional interrogations and punitive measures, as the Communist Party sought to portray them as examples of failure and betrayal. Because they were deemed untrustworthy, they were not reinstated on the front lines. Instead, they were used as negative examples to further indoctrinate the public, which served the Communist Party's interests. This treatment was part of a broader strategy to reinforce discipline and suppress dissent. The regime used such prisoners as scapegoats to illustrate the severe consequences of failure and to solidify the Communist Party's control over its citizens. The soldiers were blamed for failing to follow orders, which led to their capture, thus implying that without the party's guidance, failure was inevitable. They were also accused of being weak and cowardly, serving as a warning to others not to emulate them. The aim was to instill fear and ensure that no one would question the party's authority or its version of heroism and loyalty. Before the end of World War II, in September 1944, Andrei Chikatilo began primary school. Despite being a diligent and intelligent student, the traumas of his past had a profound impact on him. Gaunt and suffering from health issues, his stomach was swollen, likely due to prolonged malnutrition. This condition, known as edema, involves fluid accumulation in the tissues, including the abdomen, leading to frequent fainting both at school and at home. He often wore homespun clothes, making him a target for ridicule by other children. His vision problems, being nearsighted, compelled him to read more at home to compensate for what he missed on the blackboard. He did not wear glasses, possibly to avoid further ridicule due to his parents' financial constraints, or both. His classmates continually bullied him due to his physical stature and timid demeanor. His gaunt appearance and frequent fainting episodes made him an easy target for their taunts. At home, both he and his sister Tatiana were persistently criticized by their mother, whose harsh and unforgiving nature left a deep emotional scar. Tatiana later reflected that, despite the severe hardships they faced, their father was a kind and gentle presence, contrasting sharply with their mother's relentless severity. His kindness provided a rare sense of comfort and stability amid the pervasive harshness of their home life, underscoring the emotional strain they endured. All these experiences led Chikatilo to become increasingly withdrawn, channeling his energy into his studies and developing a passion for learning and memorizing information, as he found little joy in other aspects of life. At school, he was praised by his teachers for his academic performance, though he faced relentless bullying from his classmates. At home, his mother was constantly critical, scolding him for minor issues, which created a tense environment. His sister, Tatiana, was his only source of solace and support, providing him with comfort amid the harshness he faced both at school and at home. During his adolescence, Andrei Chikatilo was a model student and an ardent communist. By the age of 14, he had risen to the position of editor for the school newspaper and, 2 years later, was elected chairman of the Children's Communist Party. An enthusiastic reader of communist literature, Chikatilo was frequently entrusted with organizing street demonstrations and party events. Despite his intelligence and dedication, he struggled with severe migraines, which made these responsibilities challenging. Nonetheless, his commitment to the ideals of communism remained unwavering, and he continued to excel in his roles despite his difficulties. Despite his academic achievements and the health issues that persisted, Chikatilo's life took a turn for the worse as he entered puberty. The hormonal upheaval further complicated his situation, leading him to discover that he suffered from chronic impotence. This revelation had a profound impact on his social life, exacerbating his difficulties and exposing him to increased criticism and ridicule. The combination of his medical condition and the social scorn he faced compounded his emotional distress, contributing significantly to his growing sense of isolation and frustration. As Chikatilo's hormones surged during puberty, he observed his peers falling in love and engaging in sexual relationships, which only deepened his sense of frustration and inadequacy. His impotence and the accompanying sense of shame intensified his distress, making him feel even more isolated. As he struggled with these issues, his peers began to notice his peculiar behavior, leading to increased ridicule and mockery. This relentless bullying not only exacerbated his self-loathing but also deepened his hatred towards himself, compounding his emotional suffering. Andrei Chikatilo was always shy and reserved. His first love was Lilia Beresheva when he was 17 years old. They became friends while working together on the school newspaper in Rostov-on-Don. Despite their close friendship, Chikatilo never mustered the courage to express his romantic feelings, as he was overwhelmed by his emotions. Around the same age, he had a troubling experience where he assaulted an 11-year-old friend of his sister's. This incident, where he ejaculated uncontrollably, made him realize that conventional sex would never satisfy him. His reputation deteriorated even further following these events, leading to increased humiliation as girls snickered behind his back. Shadowed by the disgrace of his father's military failures, he became a genuine outcast, burdened by both social rejection and familial shame. He completed his studies with impressive grades and made an attempt to gain admission to Moscow University. However, his application was unsuccessful. While he speculated that his father's tarnished reputation might have influenced the decision, the reality was that the competition for spots at the university was exceptionally fierce, and the number of openings was extremely limited. He chose not to reapply to university and instead moved to Kursk, where he spent 3 months working as an unskilled laborer. In 1995, he enrolled in a vocational school with aspirations of becoming a communications technician. That same year, he entered his first serious relationship with a local girl who was 2 years younger than him. Despite their efforts, Chikatilo struggled with erectile dysfunction during their attempts at intimacy, which ultimately led to the girl ending the relationship 8 months later. After completing his vocational training, Chikatilo relocated to Nizhny Tagil in the Urals to work on a construction project. During his time there, he also enrolled in a correspondence course at the Moscow Electrotechnical Institute of Communications, hoping to advance his education and career prospect. Unfortunately, his professional ambitions were abruptly interrupted when he was drafted into the Red Army in 1957. Chikatilo served his military service from 1957 to 1960. Initially stationed as a border guard along the Central Asian frontier, he was later transferred to a communications unit of the KGB in East Berlin. Far from alleviating his personal struggles, these assignments only deepened his sense of isolation and demoralization. His fellow soldiers observed his peculiar behavior and, as was common in such environments, subjected him to ridicule and humiliation. Some of his comrades even went so far as to accuse him of being gay, further exacerbating his emotional turmoil. At the end of his military service, Chikatilo joined the Communist Party. Despite the personal challenges and humiliation he faced during his time in the army, he sought to integrate into the political landscape of the Soviet Union, hoping to align himself with the prevailing ideologies and gain stability in his career and personal life. After completing his military service, Chikatilo returned to his hometown, where he lived with his parents and assisted with work on the collective farm. Soon after, he entered into a relationship with a divorced woman. Despite his hopes for a fresh start, his persistent erectile dysfunction, compounded by the trauma of his past, began to strain the relationship, which quickly became toxic. The woman, desperate for a solution, confided in her friends about Chikatilo's condition. Instead of offering constructive advice, her friends ridiculed him and gossiped about the issue, further amplifying his embarrassment and deepening his sense of isolation. The relationship ended after just 3 months, leaving Chikatilo in a state of profound despair. The relentless cycle of humiliation and rejection deepened his feelings of isolation and inadequacy. Struggling with unresolved emotional pain and the stigma surrounding his condition, he found himself increasingly withdrawn and disheartened, his prospects for a stable and fulfilling life seeming more distant than ever. The intense humiliation drove Chikatilo into a profound depression, leading him to attempt suicide. He tried to hang himself but was rescued by his mother and a few younger neighbors. Reflecting on his despair, he later said, "I believe that no one would want a person like me." All his experiences left him with a bitter sense of regret, and he sought a new beginning to escape the painful past that had haunted him. He decided to relocate to Rostov, Russia, where he secured a job in telecommunications and rented an apartment close to his workplace. His sister, having completed her schooling shortly thereafter, moved in with him, soon joined by their parents. Within 6 months, Tatiana married and moved out of her brother's apartment to start her new life. Despite her happiness, she felt a persistent sense of guilt and was deeply troubled by her brother's ongoing struggles with embarrassment. Eager to help, she resolved to support him in finding a suitable partner, hoping to improve his situation and bring some stability to his life. Tatiana decided to introduce Andrei to a friend of hers, Feodosia Odnicheva. Despite the marriage being arranged, Chikatilo felt a genuine attraction to Feodosia, and they were married just 2 weeks later in 1963. Unfortunately, Chikatilo's erectile dysfunction prevented them from consummating their marriage. Although Feodosia could have left due to the sexual difficulties, she chose to remain with Andrei. Her decision was largely influenced by the fact that he was neither an alcoholic nor abusive, qualities that were exceptionally rare in the turbulent times they were living through. Additionally, he held a respectable job, which further contributed to her decision to stay. Feodosia was understanding of Chikatilo's condition. Despite her strong desire to have children, they devised a solution. He would ejaculate outside, then use his fingers to push the semen inside. This unconventional method led to the birth of their first child, a daughter named Ludmila, in 1965. 4 years later, in 1969, they welcomed a son named Yuri. In 1964, Chikatilo decided to enroll at Rostov University, where he pursued studies in Russian literature and psychology. He successfully earned his degree in 1970. Following his graduation, he initially worked as a regional sports manager, a position he held for about a year. Soon after, he transitioned to a career in education, taking up a role as a Russian literature teacher at school number 32 in Novochtinsk. His life as an educator was far from easy. This period marked the beginning of the first signs of abuse from him. Being timid and different, he never managed to assert his authority as a teacher, and his colleagues viewed him with suspicion, further isolating him. The difficulties he faced in commanding respect in the classroom and the lack of support from his peers contributed to his growing sense of alienation and frustration. Eventually, Chikatilo began to face severe mockery from his students, who used derogatory nicknames such as the ogre, the sexual monster, and the disgusting one. These nicknames reflected the deep-seated disdain and discomfort he evoked. Although he was well-versed in the subject matter he taught, his demeanor made him an easy target for malicious students. His inability to assert control and maintain order in the classroom allowed their disrespectful behavior to flourish. Students frequently acted out in his presence, with some even going so far as to smoke during lessons, openly mocking him and undermining his authority. This lack of respect from students and colleagues exacerbated his humiliation. Despite his knowledge and expertise, the constant mockery and the atmosphere of derision deeply deepened his isolation and frustration, undermining his ability to teach and manage the class effectively. One of his responsibilities was ensuring all the children were in their dorm rooms at night. He was seen on multiple occasions entering the girls' rooms, seemingly attempting to catch them while they were changing clothes. On some occasions, he saw teenagers engaging in sexual intercourse, which made him feel even more discouraged because even at his age of 30 years he was unable to feel such pleasure. In May 1973, Chikatilo committed his first direct sexual abuse against a student, pounced on a 15-year-old girl, and grabbed her breasts and genitals, ejaculating uncontrollably when the innocent girl was struggling to escape from Chikatilo's grip. Months later, Chikatilo locked a girl in the classroom, beat her, and sexually abused her. Despite his abnormal actions, he did not undergo any disciplinary investigation or face any formal scrutiny at first. However, as complaints began to accumulate, the principal issued him an ultimatum: either resign voluntarily or face termination. Chikatilo chose to resign, but he did so discreetly and found another teaching position at a different school in Novoshakhtinsk in January 1974. At his new job, Chikatilo's troubling behavior persisted. The new school, facing budgetary constraints, eventually included him among the first to be dismissed in 1978. Despite this setback, he secured another position at school number 33 in Shakhta, a mining town where he carried his inappropriate behavior with him. By the mid-1970s, Chikatilo's sexual obsessions had become more pronounced, and he developed a growing desire to witness naked girls. This led him to frequent public restrooms, where he would secretly spy on young girls. To engage with the young girls and build their trust, he began buying chewing gum, which he used as an excuse to approach them. Through this method, Chikatilo abused 3 girls. Chikatilo's teaching career came to a halt in March 1981, following a series of complaints about inappropriate conduct involving minors of both sexes. Shortly thereafter, he transitioned to a new role as a salesman for a construction materials factory. This job required him to travel extensively throughout the Soviet Union to procure raw materials and negotiate contracts, providing him with a fresh opportunity but also exposing him to new environments. Chikatilo often watched homeless individuals meeting in forests or secluded areas to have sex, doing so with a sense of jealousy. These voyeuristic activities caused him great frustration and envy, as he was unable to engage in normal sexual relations due to erectile dysfunction. This feeling of inadequacy and anger deepened, fueling his violent behavior. In September 1978, Andrei secretly purchased a house in the city of Shakhta, which would later become the site of many of his horrific crimes. His first victim was a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakatnova. He lured her into the house with the promise of sweets, and here the monster within him was unleashed. He tried to rape her but failed as he could not maintain an erection, which annoyed him, and he began to strangle and stab her 3 times in the abdomen while he ejaculated involuntarily. In an interview after his arrest in 1990, he said that he remembers that after he stabbed her, the girl said something in a very hoarse voice, then strangled her again and threw her body into the Grushevka River in the vicinity. The girl's body was found beneath a nearby bridge 2 days later. After Yelena's death, Chikatilo came to the grim realization that he could experience sexual pleasure and orgasm solely through acts of violence and sexual assault. He later confessed that the compulsion to release his dark desires was overpowering. Initially, he made efforts to curb these violent impulses, frequently rushing home in a desperate attempt to control his urges and avoid succumbing to them. He almost got caught. The continuation of Chikatilo's crimes might have been avoided if the police had properly pursued the abundant evidence available: bloodstains in the snow near Chikatilo's fence, neighbors who observed his presence on the night of December 22nd when the tragedy occurred, and Yelena's backpack found on the riverbank directly across from Chikatilo's house, suggesting it was discarded from that direction. Additionally, a witness described a man with a strikingly similar appearance to Chikatilo, who was seen with Yelena at the bus station where she was last observed alive. Despite this substantial evidence, the police, likely under immense pressure from the horrific nature of the case, hastily concluded their investigation. They overlooked Chikatilo, who was a party member with a seemingly clean record, and instead sought quick resolutions and scapegoats, thereby neglecting the true perpetrator. Instead, the police chose to focus their investigation on Alexander Kravchenko, a 25-year-old laborer with a troubling past. Kravchenko had previously been convicted of the rape and murder of a teenage girl. He was arrested based on this previous conviction. During the search of his residence, investigators discovered bloodstains on his wife's jumper. Testing revealed that the blood belonged to both Yelena and Kravchenko's wife, which initially pointed to Kravchenko's involvement. During that time, forensic tools were quite rudimentary, and it was not uncommon for blood samples to be mixed up or lost, which often complicated investigations. These errors contributed to difficulties in investigating and solving cases, frequently leading to confusion and delays in identifying and apprehending offenders. Kravchenko had a very strong alibi for the afternoon of December 22, 1978. He had been at home with his wife and her friend throughout the afternoon, and the couple's neighbors could confirm this. Despite this, the police began to intimidate Kravchenko's wife and her friend, pressuring them into making statements that directly incriminated Kravchenko. They claimed that he was not at home that evening, further complicating the investigation. Confronted with these allegations, Kravchenko was charged with the crime in 1979. During his trial, he retracted his initial confession, which had been coerced by the police, and declared his innocence. Despite his retraction, Kravchenko was convicted for the murder of the young girl and sentenced to death. In December 1980, the Supreme Court reduced his sentence to 15 years in prison, the maximum term allowed at that time. However, under intense pressure from the victim's family, Kravchenko was retried, wrongfully convicted again, and ultimately executed in 1983. This wrongful execution is another death that can be attributed to Chikatilo. On September 3, 1981, Chikatilo, having just left a public library in downtown Rostov, came across 17-year-old Larissa Kachenko, a boarding school student, waiting at a bus stop. He couldn't resist. He enticed her with the promise of relaxation and vodka, suggesting they visit a secluded area near the forest at Don River. Once they reached the remote spot in the forest, Andrei tore off her clothes and threw her to the ground, attempting to assault her but failing, which only fueled his anger. The girl screamed in fear, and Andrei stuffed mud into her mouth to silence her. Frustrated by his inability to achieve an erection, he began to brutally beat her. Being a spontaneous crime, he lacked a knife and resorted to using his teeth to further mutilate her. In a moment of frenzy, he bit off her nipple, chewing it briefly before swallowing it. Her body was discovered the next day, partially covered with leaves, branches, and torn newspaper pages. 9 months after killing Kachenko, in June 1982, Chikatilo was traveling by bus to the Bagaevsky district of Rostov to buy vegetables. Instead of changing buses in the village of Donskoy, he decided to continue on foot. While walking from the bus station, he encountered a 13-year-old girl named Lyubov Buryuk, who was on her way home. The two walked about a quarter of a mile until they were covered by dense undergrowth, which shielded them from potential witnesses. Chikatilo then attacked the girl, dragging her into the thick vegetation. Her body was found on July 27, covered in wounds to the head, neck, chest, and pelvis. Many of the injuries were to her neck, suggesting that Chikatilo had attacked her from behind, stabbing her with a knife and slashing her throat. At this point, Chikatilo acknowledged that he no longer wanted to suppress his perverse urges. During his interrogation, he confessed that he was driven by a desire to relive the sense of control he had experienced during his previous crimes. He admitted that the thrill of domination and power had become an essential part of his violent compulsions. On July 25, 1982, Chikatilo lured 14-year-old Lyubov Volobaeva with the promise of a special gift and led her into the orchard near the Krasnodar airport. Her body was found on August 7. On August 13, 1982, Chikatilo claimed his first male victim, 9-year-old Oleg Pashadayev. The boy was killed in the forest near the village of Enem in the Republic of Adygea. Oleg's body was never discovered, and the investigation into his disappearance was not linked to Chikatilo's other crimes at the time. On August 16, 1982, 16-year-old Olga Kuprina, a runaway from the Semikarakovsky district, was abducted and murdered by Chikatilo. Her body was discovered by a soldier who was gathering firewood. On September 8, 1982, 18-year-old Irina Korobelnikova, who was struggling with unstable housing and financial difficulties, encountered Chikatilo. He offered her a ride on public transportation and lured her with promises of a job opportunity. Once he gained her trust, he led her to a secluded part of the forest near the Don River. There, he carried out his usual sadistic ritual, repeating the horrific acts he had committed before. Irina Korobelnikova's body was discovered on September 20th, but it remained unidentified until 1985. Her father later erected a monument at the site of her death. May you rest in peace, Irina, along with all the other victims. Sergei Kuzmin, a 15-year-old student who had run away from his school dormitory, was murdered on September 15, 1982. His body was found on January 12, 1983. No soft tissue was left upon his remains, which were initially determined to be those of a female. Chikatilo took pleasure in mutilating his victims' genitalia, often severing their genitals and making boys appear more feminine. This likely gave him a sense of superiority. Olga Stalmashenok, age 10, was on her way home from piano lessons in Novoshakhtinsk on December 11, 1982. Chikatilo lured her off the bus and, despite her fear of the forest, managed to convince her to follow him. As her fear grew, he promised to take her somewhere safe and comfortable. Instead, he led her to a secluded area in the forest, where he revealed his true nature and took her life. Her body was discovered on April 14, 1983, in a cornfield. Laura Sarkisyan, a 15-year-old of Armenian descent, had run away from home, was suspected of being on Chikatilo's victim list. But Chikatilo was cleared of this murder at his trial. Irina Dunenkova, a 13-year-old girl with mental disabilities, was known to Chikatilo before he killed her. Her body was discovered in Aviators Park in Rostov on August 8, 1983. Ludmila Tsuba, a 24-year-old homeless woman and mother of two, crossed paths with Chikatilo in July 1983. Her body was found on March 12, 1984, near a bus stop in a wooded area. Igor Gudkov, at just 7 years old, was the youngest and the first male victim linked to the investigation. His tragic and unjust death occurred on August 9, 1983. Andrei Chikatilo later confessed, when he was caught, to murdering an unidentified prostitute between July and August 1983. She was between 18 and 25 years old, had been seeking clients, and was easily lured by him. Her body was discovered on October 9th, but the extreme brutality inflicted upon her made identification impossible. Since she was either alone or her disappearance went unnoticed, her identity remains unknown. Valentina Checholina, age 22, encountered the Red Ripper of Rostov in September 1983. Her body was discovered on November 27, 1983, in a wooded area near Kirpichnaya Station. Vera Shevkun, age 19, was murdered on October 27, 1983, near Shakhta. Her body was found 3 days later, on October 30th. Sergei Markov, age 14, fell victim to Andrei Chikatilo on December 27, 1983, while returning home from a work experience. His body was discovered on January 4, 1984. Natalia Shalapenina, age 17, was a close friend of Valentina Checholina. She met the Red Ripper of Rostov on January 9, 1984, and was killed in Aviators Park, a location frequently visited by Chikatilo to satisfy his dark urges. Marta Ryabenko, age 44, was the oldest victim of the Red Ripper of Rostov. She was also killed in Aviators Park, and her body was found the following day on February 22, 1984. Andrei Chikatilo, already emboldened by a lengthy list of previous victims, grew increasingly brazen. On May 25, 1984, he claimed the lives of Tatiana Petrosian and her daughter, Svetlana. He first attacked and murdered Tatiana, then chased down Svetlana for nearly half a mile. Upon catching her, he brutally killed her with a hammer. Her decapitated body was discovered on July 5 in a wooded area near the Kirpichnaya station, an area Chikatilo frequented for his crimes. Chikatilo had known both victims since 1978. His lack of a specific target made the investigation more complex, as he did not fit a predictable pattern. This unpredictability, combined with the rarity of such horrific cases in the communist era, where the populace was often subdued and unaccustomed to such violence, added to the challenge. Chikatilo was a difficult predator to apprehend, not only because of the rudimentary forensic tools available at the time, but also due to the seemingly unconnected nature of his victims. His actions shocked a society unprepared for such malevolence, making the hunt for him all the more arduous. Dmitry Toshnikov was a 10-year-old boy with a passion for stamp collecting. On March 24, 1984, he was at a kiosk in Novoshakhtinsk when Chikatilo approached him, pretending to be a fellow collector. Chikatilo lured the boy by promising to show him his collection. Tragically, Dmitry's body was found 3 days later. Multiple witnesses saw the boy in Chikatilo's presence and were able to provide investigators with a detailed description of him. Physical evidence, including traces of semen and saliva, was found on the child's body, and a footprint was discovered near the scene. Despite these clues, Chikatilo remained elusive and was not apprehended. Yelena Bakulina, aged 21, was brutally stabbed to death on June 22, 1984. Her body was discovered on August 27 in the Bagasinsky region of Rostov, barely concealed under leaves and branches, showing minimal effort by the killer to hide the crime. Dmitry Illarionov, a 13-year-old boy, disappeared in Rostov on July 10, 1984, while on his way to obtain a medical certificate for summer camp registration. His lifeless body was found on August 12. Anne Lemasheva, a 19-year-old girl, vanished on her way home from a medical appointment. Once again, the Red Ripper of Rostov struck near the Kirpichnaya station, a location seemingly cursed with so much tragedy. The area became a graveyard for many innocent victims, their lives cruelly cut short, leaving a haunting stain on the place. Sarmite Sana, a 20-year-old woman from Riga, met her end on July 28, 1984, when she encountered the Ripper of Rostov. Her body was discovered in Aviators Park in September 1984. She was the last victim for whom Andrei Chikatilo confessed. Amid his criminal activities, Chikatilo was dismissed from his job in February after being accused of stealing 3 rolls of linoleum. Despite being asked to resign voluntarily, he vehemently denied the accusations. Nevertheless, Chikatilo managed to secure a similar position in Rostov by August 1. An unidentified woman, estimated to be between 20 and 25 years old, was encountered by Chikatilo along the banks of the Chirchik River between August 8 and 11, 1984. She was traveling toward the city of Uzbek, and her decapitated body was discovered on August 16. Unfortunately, she was never identified. Akmarul Sidelieva, a 10-year-old girl, tragically lost her life on August 13, 1984. Having run away from her home in Alma-Ata, Kazakh SSR, she was lured by Chikatilo from a train in Tashkent. She was brutally beaten and stabbed in a cornfield. Alexander Chepel, an 11-year-old boy, was murdered near the banks of the Don River on August 28, 1984. His strangled body was found on September 2, near where Alexieva had previously been killed. Irina Luchinskaya, a 24-year-old librarian, encountered the Red Ripper on her way to a sauna on September 6, 1984. She was murdered in Aviators Park. Natalia Poklistova, aged 18, met her untimely end on August 1, 1985, near Domodedovo Airport in Moscow Oblast. Her body was discovered on August 3, just 200 meters from her home. Irina Gilyayeva, also 18, was killed in a grove of trees near the town of Shakhta on August 27, 1985. Her body was found the following day, close to a bus stop. Oleg Makarenkov, a 12-year-old student at a boarding school, was tragically murdered in Rivda on May 16, 1987. Andrei Chikatilo himself led the police to the boy's body. Ivan Bilovetsky, also 12, was killed in a wooded area near a railway in Zaporizhia, Ukraine. His lifeless body was discovered by his father on July 30, 1987. Yuri Tereshchanik, a 16-year-old attending a vocational school, was lured away by Chikatilo from a train in Leningrad on September 15, 1987. Chikatilo later guided the police to the location of Yuri's body. An unidentified woman, estimated to be between 22 and 28 years old, was murdered on the grounds of a metal factory near Krasny Sulin station. Her body was found on April 6. Alexei Voronko, a 9-year-old boy, was abducted by Chikatilo while traveling on a bus to Artyomovsk. He was killed in Ilovaisk, Ukraine. On July 14, 1988, Yevgeny Muratov, aged 15, became the first victim killed in Rostov since 1985. His body was found in a forest near Dnilehosla station on April 10, 1989. Tatyana Rajova, a 16-year-old runaway, was murdered on February 28, 1989, in Kamyansk-Shakhtinsky. Chikatilo killed her in the apartment of his daughter in Shakhta. Her dismembered body was discovered on March 9. Alexander Diakonov, an 8-year-old boy, was tragically murdered on May 11, 1989, just one day after his birthday. His small body was discovered by a taxi driver on July 14. Alexei Moishev, a 10-year-old boy from Kochugino, Vladimir Oblast, was killed on June 20, 1989. Yelena Varga, a 19-year-old student from Hungary who had a child, was enticed to a bus stop and murdered in a wooded area near Rostov on August 19, 1989. Alexei Kabutov, a 10-year-old boy, encountered the Rostov Ripper on August 28, 1989, near a theater in Shakhta. His body was buried in a shallow grave in a nearby cemetery. Chikatilo led the police to the remains after his arrest. Andrei Kravchenko, 11 years old, was abducted from the street near his home in Shakhta on January 14, 1990. His emasculated body was discovered in a wooded area on February 19. Yaroslav Makarov, a 10-year-old boy, disappeared on March 7, 1990, from a train station in Rostov while returning from school. He was killed in the botanical garden in Rostov, with his tongue and sexual organs removed. His body was found the following day. Lubov Zuyeva, a 31-year-old woman, crossed paths with the Rostov Ripper on April 4, 1990, while traveling from Novocherkassk to Shakhta. Her skeletal remains were found in the forest near Dnilehosla station on August 24. Viktor Petrov, a 13-year-old boy, was lured by Chikatilo from Rostov-Glavny station on July 28, 1990. Viktor and his family were waiting for a bus early in the morning. He was murdered in the botanical garden in Rostov, just a few meters from where Makarov was killed. Ivan Fomin, an 11-year-old boy, was killed at Novocherkassk Municipal Beach on August 14, 1990, while changing clothes in the bushes. His body, stabbed 42 times and deprived of his male organs, was discovered on August 17. October 17, 1990, Vadim Gromov, a 16-year-old student from Shakhta with mental disabilities, disappeared while traveling to Taganrog. Viktor Tishenko, also 16 years old, was murdered in Shakhta on October 30, 1990. Viktor, a strong young boy, fought hard for his life, leaving a bite mark on his finger, a crucial piece of evidence that later helped the investigators. July 28, 1990, Chikatilo lured Dmitry Tokov with the promise of sharing a warm meal at his vacation home. Dmitry's body was later found in a forest near the Dnilehosla station in the Rostov Oblast on August 6, 1990. Svetlana Korostik, a 22-year-old homeless woman, was killed in the wooded area near Dnilehosla station on November 6, 1990. Her body was discovered on November 13. This is the blacklist of the heinous crimes committed by Andrei Chikatilo. While the known victims are documented, Chikatilo is suspected of many more crimes that have not been officially confirmed. Chikatilo was a monster who manifested his uncontrollable mental illness over an extensive area. During that period, there were numerous missing sex workers whose identities were never established and whose cases remained unsolved. In addition to the confirmed victims, Chikatilo was suspected of the disappearance of children whose bodies were never found, and investigations into these cases did not progress. He also extended his killing spree into his native province of Ukraine, and his activities were poorly documented. There were also other unconfirmed prior crimes during investigations where no conclusive evidence was found. Between 1978 and 1990, a true monster roamed the earth, committing a series of horrific crimes, largely due to the context of Soviet Russia. To say the police were unprepared is a severe understatement. In reality, no one was adequately equipped to confront such a predator, and even today, it's hard to imagine being fully prepared for such horrors. During the communist era, crimes were typically driven by theft or personal vendettas, not by the sadistic pleasure of a killer. The concept of someone killing purely for their own twisted gratification was almost inconceivable to both the public and the authorities of that time. This profound disconnect from the nature of such extreme violence likely contributed to why Chikatilo managed to evade capture for so long. His crimes were unprecedented in the region, further complicating efforts to understand and respond to his depravity. The rarity of such acts, coupled with the rudimentary forensic tools and investigative methods available, made the search for him a daunting challenge. The shock of such brutality in an era and place where violent crime of this nature was virtually unheard of only deepened the difficulty of grasping the reality of the situation, allowing Chikatilo to continue his reign of terror unchecked for an extended period. But this couldn't go on forever. The Butcher of Rostov left a trail far too evident to be ignored. The police began connecting the victims, noting the similar brutality in the nature of the crimes. By 1983, 4 victims were linked to the same killer. A team of investigators from Moscow, led by Major Mikhail Fetisov, was dispatched to Rostov to oversee the investigations, which became known as Operation Forest Path. Fetisov assembled a team of 10 investigators from Rostov and tasked them with investigating all 4 murders. In March, Fetisov appointed a new forensic analyst, Viktor Burakev, to lead the investigation. In early September 1983, several young individuals confessed to the linked crimes, though they were merely intellectually disabled youths who only confessed under prolonged and brutal interrogation. 3 known homosexuals and 1 convicted sex offender committed suicide as a result of the investigators' harsh and psychological tactics. Despite the tragic consequences for these individuals, the intense investigations led to the resolution of over 1,000 unrelated crimes, including 95 murders, 140 aggravated assaults, and 245 rapes. Whether these cases were resolved correctly remains uncertain, only God knows. Despite the brutal tactics used by authorities to force confessions from suspects, many of whom broke under extreme pressure and falsely confessed just to escape the harsh interrogations, the bodies continued to emerge with unmistakable signs of sadistic violence. This made the forced confessions invalid. The police were left with a daunting problem. The Red Ripper was still free, driven by his sadistic and psychopathic tendencies. The following month, Stalmashenok's body was discovered. Burakev was summoned to the crime scene, where he examined the numerous knife wounds and observed striations around the child's eye sockets. Comparing these details with previous cases, he concluded without a doubt that they were dealing with a serial killer. On September 13, 1984, Andrei Chikatilo was spotted by 2 undercover police officers as he attempted to strike up conversations with young women at a bus station in Rostov. The detectives shadowed him through the city, observing him approach and harass women, and even commit acts of frotteurism in public. When he reached a central market, they apprehended him. During a search, the officers found a 20-centimeter knife, a length of rope, and a jar of Vaseline in his possession. Further investigation revealed that Chikatilo was already under scrutiny for a minor theft at his previous job, providing the police with a legal basis to obtain a blood sample from him. This was when the police first started to consider him a potential suspect. However, Chikatilo had a rare medical condition that complicated the investigation. His blood sample was compared to the one found on the body of Dmitry Toshnikov, the young stamp enthusiast. Due to his medical condition, which affected blood test results, the initial analysis failed to provide a clear match between the samples. Chikatilo's blood was identified as type A, while the sample from Dmitry Toshnikov indicated type AB. This discrepancy was due to a rare medical condition known as non-secretor status, where a person's blood type cannot be determined from bodily fluids like semen or saliva. Although the police recorded Chikatilo's blood type and the event of his arrest, they overlooked it in the main investigation, dismissing him as a minor nuisance. He was ultimately found guilty of theft from the former employer and sentenced to 1 year in prison. His Communist Party membership was also revoked. He was released from custody on December 12, 1984, after serving just 3 months of his sentence. After his release from prison in 1984, Chikatilo found employment at the supply department of a locomotive factory in Novocherkassk, maintaining a low profile. He did not commit any further crimes until August 1, 1985, when he encountered Natalia Poklistova, who was standing on a platform near the railway close to Domodedovo Airport. Suspecting that the killer might have traveled by plane, investigators examined all Aeroflot passenger lists. However, Chikatilo traveled by train and bus, and therefore did not appear on any flight records. The complexity of the case led Viktor Burakov to worry that he might lose track of the Rostov Ripper, who had begun altering his killing methods, likely to complicate the manhunt. With each new crime, the pressure on investigators mounted. The cumulative effect of these challenges, along with the horrific details he had encountered, significantly impacted Burakov's health. As a result, he had to spend a brief period in the hospital to recuperate. Chikatilo's victims endured unspeakable suffering. He inflicted severe mutilations on their genitals and removed their eyes, a grisly act possibly motivated by some form of superstition. Additionally, bite marks were discovered on the dismembered bodies, including traces on the uteruses of women and the missing genitals of boys. These horrific details, along with the intense pressure from both the public and his superiors, took a significant toll on Burakov. The graphic nature of the crimes and the relentless pursuit of the killer overwhelmed him, leading to a brief period of emotional and mental exhaustion. Nonetheless, Burakov's commitment to the case remained steadfast. Fully aware of the urgency to apprehend the Butcher of Rostov, he overcame his temporary setback and redoubled his efforts to bring the elusive murderer to justice. In 1985, a special prosecutor named Isa Kostoyev was appointed to oversee the investigation. He significantly expanded his team, adding 15 more prosecutors and 29 detectives, all dedicated exclusively to the manhunt. This renewed focus led to a meticulous reinvestigation of the crimes. The police began interrogating known sex offenders and homosexuals who were often targeted due to the pervasive xenophobia and societal prejudice in Soviet Russia. In the following month, police resumed undercover patrols at the Rostov station, aiming to catch any suspicious activity linked to the killer. At Burakov's request, the police consulted Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a psychiatrist who was the first to be involved in a serial killer investigation within the Soviet Union. All relevant crime data, evidence, and medical reports were made available to Dr. Bukhanovsky. His task was to create a psychological profile of the unknown killer, to provide new insights into the perpetrator's behavior and motives. Dr. Bukhanovsky compiled a comprehensive 65-page psychological profile of the killer, characterizing him as a reclusive man in his late 40s to early 50s. He depicted the perpetrator as having endured a childhood fraught with trauma, isolation, and suffering. Despite being educated, married, and a father, the individual was a sadist who struggled with impotence. His sexual gratification seemed to stem solely from the suffering he inflicted upon his victims. The brutal violence and genital mutilation observed in the crimes were indicative of his deep-seated frustration and his inability to engage in normal sexual activity, resorting instead to using a knife as a substitute for his penis. Dr. Bukhanovsky also noted that many of the murders occurred during weekdays near busy transportation hubs. This observation led him to deduce that the criminal's job likely involved frequent travel during regular working hours. The profile suggested that the perpetrator was most probably connected to a production-related occupation. Chikatilo meticulously followed the investigation, avidly reading newspaper reports about the manhunt that was capturing public attention. As the media frenzy grew, he became increasingly cautious, managing to control his disturbing impulses. For nearly a year after the 1985 murder of Gulyaeva, no new victims were found in Rostov or the surrounding Moscow area bearing the Red Ripper's signature brutality. However, Chikatilo's sadistic urges could not be suppressed indefinitely. In 1987, he claimed the lives of 3 more victims, each murder occurring while he was traveling on business far from the Rostov Oblast. This strategy allowed him to distance the crimes from the ongoing manhunt in Rostov. The first victim was Oleg Makarenkov, a young boy whom Chikatilo lured with the promise of sharing a meal at his vacation home. Makarenkov was killed on May 16 near a train station in Rivda and subsequently murdered in the woods near Zaporizhia, Ukraine. On September 15, Chikatilo targeted Yuri Terashanik, a 16-year-old student from a vocational school in the forests near Leningrad. Additionally, he killed an unidentified woman aged between 22 and 28. Her body was discovered on April 6 on the grounds of a factory near the Krasny Sulin station. In 1989, the FBI dispatched a renowned criminal profiler, John Douglas, known for his expertise in behavioral analysis of serial offenders. Douglas collaborated with the Soviet investigative team to provide additional insights into the behavior and motivations of the elusive killer. His involvement aimed to enhance the understanding of the criminal's patterns and psychological profile, contributing valuable perspectives to the ongoing investigation. Chikatilo continued his killing spree until 1990, despite the relentless pursuit by the police. The discovery of several more victims near train stations along the Rostov Oblast route prompted Burakev to devise a new plan, which was promptly approved. To limit Chikatilo's freedom of movement, major train stations were fortified with a significant presence of police officers and undercover agents. These officials patrolled the stations diligently, recording and scrutinizing the identities of men traveling with children, aiming to deter Chikatilo and disrupt his patterns. Smaller stations were staffed with undercover agents only, creating a controlled environment that forced him to operate within a narrower, closely monitored area. A total of 360 agents were deployed across the transportation network, ensuring comprehensive surveillance. Even in areas where uniforms were not visible, covert monitoring was in place. Female officers, posing as solitary travelers from distant regions, circulated through transportation hubs, presenting themselves as vulnerable and isolated, ideal bait for a predator like Chikatilo. Some female officers went to great lengths, dressing in simple clothing and wandering through local forests to collect mushrooms, a common seasonal activity in the area. This strategic maneuver was designed to lure Chikatilo into making a mistake while maintaining vigilant oversight of potential targets. On November 6, 1990, Chikatilo committed his final murder, killing and mutilating 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik near a wooded area by the Dnilho station. A police officer, Igor Rybakov, saw Chikatilo emerging from the forest. Chikatilo stopped at a well to wash his face and hands. Rybakov noticed that Chikatilo's coat had dirt and grass stains on the elbows, and there was a red mark on his cheek, which he was washing off. Additionally, Rybakov observed a severe wound on one of Chikatilo's fingers. This situation seemed suspicious because Chikatilo was dressed too formally for someone collecting mushrooms, a common activity in the woods at that time of year. He was also carrying a nylon sports bag, not suitable for mushroom gathering. Rybakov stopped Chikatilo to check his identification but, without a clear reason to arrest him, allowed him to leave. However, Rybakov filed a report upon returning to his office, noting Chikatilo's name and the bloodstain he had seen on his face. Svetlana's body was discovered on November 13, 1990, prompting the police to call in all officers stationed at Dnilhos and review their reports. When they reached the report filed by Igor Rybakov, they recognized Chikatilo's name, recalling his previous interrogations in 1984 and his inclusion on a list of suspects in 1987. This recognition led them to investigate Chikatilo's past more thoroughly, revealing a pattern of suspicious behavior. As they delved deeper, they uncovered troubling aspects of Chikatilo's history, including his unsettling conduct during his tenure as a teacher and his dismissal due to multiple complaints of sexual harassment. The investigation revealed that Chikatilo had been present near the locations of many of the crimes. The accumulating evidence in his previous criminal record painted a damning picture, leading the authorities to intensify their focus on him as a prime suspect in the ongoing serial killings. 6 days after surveillance commenced, Chikatilo was seen leaving his home with a large jar, which he filled with beer at a local kiosk. He then continued his suspicious behavior by approaching children on the streets of Novocherkassk, attempting to engage them in conversation, likely with the intent to lure them. His actions were closely monitored, and upon exiting a cafe, 4 undercover officers apprehended him. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and placed inside an unmarked police car. Despite the gravity of the situation, Chikatilo remained composed, giving little away about his thoughts or emotions. Upon Chikatilo's arrest, investigators quickly moved to gather evidence and insights into his actions. They discovered a knife, 2 lengths of rope, and other suspicious items in his possession. These findings, along with a blood sample taken from him, added weight to their case. Chikatilo was placed in a cell at the KGB headquarters in Rostov, alongside an informant tasked with encouraging him to talk, hoping he would reveal incriminating details. Chikatilo initially claimed that the police were making a mistake, as they had in 1984 when he was wrongfully accused. He aimed to instill doubt in the investigators by suggesting they were once again mishandling the case. By doing so, he hoped to shift the focus from his guilt to the competence of the police, trying to undermine their confidence in their investigation. However, the police remained resolute and conducted the procedures meticulously. They noticed Chikatilo had a bitten finger missing a fingernail, which medical examiners confirmed was the result of a human bite treated with iodine. This injury was consistent with an encounter involving his victim, Viktor Tishenko, a strong young boy who fought for his life, leaving marks on Chikatilo's body and at the crime scene. This evidence further incriminated Chikatilo, contradicting his attempts to deflect suspicion and bolstering the case against him. It's likely that Chikatilo treated the wound on his finger himself to avoid appearing in medical records, thereby not drawing attention to himself. Chikatilo's blood was tested again, leading investigators to discover his rare condition, which had initially confused them. During the interrogation, Chikatilo vehemently denied all charges against him. However, he did confess to his inappropriate behavior during his teaching career, likely hoping to portray himself as someone with minor issues rather than a dangerous criminal. He aimed to appear sincere and cooperative, possibly believing that by admitting to lesser faults, he could divert suspicion or gain some leniency. Chikatilo was aware that investigators had been delving into his past, and he might have suspected that they would see through his act. Despite his attempts to manipulate the situation, the seasoned investigators likely recognized his strategy. The revelation of his rare blood condition added another layer of complexity to the case, but it also underscored the importance of getting a full confession to secure a conviction. The following day, on November 21st, formal interrogation began, led by Isa Kostoyev. The interrogation strategy was carefully crafted, aiming to make Chikatilo understand the gravity of his actions and his need for medical treatment, thereby suggesting he plead insanity. Kostoyev conveyed that acknowledging his crimes and cooperating could potentially result in a more lenient sentence, as opposed to being prosecuted as a fully sane individual, which would likely lead to a harsher punishment. The investigators were acutely aware of the constraints of Soviet law, which allowed them only 10 days to hold Chikatilo without charges. This time frame was crucial, as they needed a confession to solidify their case. The team worked with urgency, knowing that without a confession, they risked the possibility of Chikatilo being released due to insufficient evidence. The pressure was immense, and every minute of those 10 days was vital in ensuring the notorious Butcher of Rostov was brought to justice. Kostoyev concentrated on the gruesome mutilations inflicted on Chikatilo's victims, aiming to make the gravity of his actions resonate in his mind. This approach, along with other tactics, such as the KGB informant subtly planting key words during the interrogation breaks, the overwhelming evidence, psychological manipulation regarding Chikatilo's mental state, and the overall pressure, gradually dismantled the defenses Chikatilo had built up. The only element missing was the good cop approach, which would have contrasted with Kostoyev's stern demeanor and potentially elicited a confession. The good cop role, despite being a cliché today, plays a crucial part in any interrogation. The suspect is kept under constant stress, confronted with overwhelming evidence, and made to grasp the seriousness of their situation and the repercussions of their actions. In cases like Chikatilo's, the interrogation often emphasizes the horrific details of the crimes committed. Once all of the suspect's defenses are shattered, the good cop emerges as the guardian angel, offering understanding and, for the first time, showing compassion. This approach subtly suggests a way out of the predicament, often encouraging the criminal to open up and confess. On November 29th, at the request of Butcher and Fetisov, Dr. Bukhanovsky was brought in to assist with the interrogation of Chikatilo. During the session, Bukhanovsky read excerpts from the 65-page psychological profile he had prepared on Chikatilo. Within 2 hours, Chikatilo broke down in tears and admitted that he did indeed feel guilty for the crimes he was accused of. After talking extensively until the evening, Bukhanovsky informed Butcher and Fetisov that Chikatilo was ready to confess. However, Chikatilo requested a day to rest, showing signs that the pressure of the interrogation and the psychological tactics used by the investigators had finally broken his resistance. With Dr. Bukhanovsky's notes in hand, Kostoyev returned to finalize the charges against Chikatilo, just as the 10-day legal holding period was about to expire. The next morning, Kostoyev resumed the interrogation, and Chikatilo confessed to 36 of the 38 murders attributed to him. However, he denied responsibility for 2 additional murders committed in 1986, which the police initially thought were his doing. Chikatilo provided a comprehensive confession describing each crime in detail, which matched the information known to the investigators. He referred to his victims as outcasts of society, particularly when discussing the boys he targeted, though not exclusively. Chikatilo explained that he would bind his victims' hands behind their backs before killing them. He typically inflicted multiple stab wounds to the chest, followed by 30 to 50 deeper thrusts, remaining on top of them until he reached orgasm. Chikatilo also described his initial hesitation and nervousness during the first few murders, but mentioned that over time, he became more methodical and confident in his actions. He revealed how he meticulously planned his crimes, selecting victims who appeared vulnerable and isolated. He often lured them with promises of money, food, or other necessities, exploiting their desperate circumstances. Chikatilo's confession also included chilling details about how he derived pleasure from the act of killing and the power he felt over his victims. Throughout the confession, Chikatilo expressed a disturbing lack of remorse. Instead, he seemed more concerned with justifying his actions by dehumanizing his victims. He claimed that his violent tendencies were beyond his control, attributing them to a compulsion that he could not resist. This admission, coupled with the gruesome nature of his crimes, painted a portrait of a deeply disturbed individual with a complete disregard for human life. Andrei Chikatilo was taken to a gymnasium to demonstrate his methods of killing, using a life-sized mannequin to replicate the scenarios. The investigators aimed to corroborate the details of his confessions with visual and physical demonstrations. Chikatilo, surrounded by law enforcement officers and forensic experts, showed how he approached his victims, often beginning with seemingly innocent conversation before overpowering them. Using the mannequin, Chikatilo demonstrated how he would tie his victims' hands behind their backs, ensuring they couldn't escape. He then illustrated the brutal techniques he used to inflict fatal injuries, describing the specific points where he would stab and mutilate his victims. This reenactment with the mannequin was both a disturbing and crucial part of the investigation, providing a visual confirmation of the methods Chikatilo described in his confessions. It helped the investigators to understand the precise nature of his crimes and ensured that all details were consistent with the evidence gathered from the crime scenes. Chikatilo's twisted mastery grew with every murder as he meticulously perfected his methods to minimize evidence. He described how he avoided getting blood on himself by knowing precisely where to stab, a grim skill he had honed over time. After subduing his victims, he would sit beside them, deriving a perverse satisfaction from their agonized cries. He found a dark solace in listening to their desperate whimpers, staying close until their hearts finally stopped. For Chikatilo, these moments weren't just about killing, they were about savoring the complete helplessness of his victims, feeling a perverse sense of fulfillment and power as life ebbed away. When asked why most of his victims had their eyes slashed rather than removed, Chikatilo explained that he was influenced by an old wives' tale, which claimed that a killer's image could be imprinted on the victim's eyes at the moment of death. However, he later realized this was merely a superstition and stopped doing it. Kostoyev felt chills when Chikatilo admitted that he sometimes tasted the blood of his victims. Chikatilo also confessed to biting off or mutilating the genitals, nipples, and tongues of his victims. In many cases, he would cut or bite off the victim's tongue while disemboweling them. Even as the victim was dying or shortly after they had died, Chikatilo would dance on the body, holding the severed tongue. Although Chikatilo initially admitted to chewing on the uterus, nipples, or testicles during moments of ecstasy, he later denied engaging in cannibalism, claiming that he discarded these body parts. However, these parts were never recovered. Nonetheless, Chikatilo did confess to swallowing the nipples and tongues of some of his victims. Chikatilo also admitted to placing his semen inside the uterus of female victims, sometimes chewing it while wandering through the hidden parts of the forest before ultimately discarding it. On November 30th, Chikatilo was formally charged with 36 murders, which he had confessed to, all committed between June 1982 and November 1990. In the days that followed, he admitted to 20 more murders that had not been previously connected to him. These additional crimes included victims from outside the Rostov Oblast, bodies that had never been found, and, in one case, a murder for which an innocent man had been wrongly executed. Chikatilo provided specific details that only the true perpetrator could know. One such victim was 14-year-old Lyubov Volobuyeva from southwestern Siberia, whom he killed in a sorghum field near Krasnodar Airport on July 25, 1982. Chikatilo approached her in the airport waiting room, where she mentioned she was awaiting a connecting flight to visit relatives in Novokuznetsk. In December 1990, Chikatilo led the police to the body of Alexei Kobatov, a boy he admitted to murdering in August 1989 and burying in a cemetery on the outskirts of Shakhta. The grave, initially dug by Chikatilo with the intention of using it for his own burial as he had contemplated suicide, instead contained the young victim. Chikatilo also led investigators to the remains of several other victims, though 3 bodies were never found. He remained in the same cell in Rostov, where he had been detained since November 20th, awaiting trial. Chikatilo was brought before the court on April 14, 1992, charged with 53 murders and 5 additional counts of molesting minors during his time as a teacher. The trial took place in Room 5 of the Rostov Provincial Court, presided over by Judge Leonid Akubzanov. Following a psychological evaluation conducted by the Serbsky Institute, the investigators held a press conference where they made the complete list of victims public. Chikatilo was placed in a specially constructed iron cage in a corner of the courtroom to protect him from the victims' families. His head was shaved, a standard procedure used in Soviet prisons to eliminate the risk of lice infestation. The media, now having unrestricted access, crafted sensational headlines such as "The Cannibal" or "The Maniac," depicting Chikatilo behind the metal bars with a demonic appearance. While awaiting trial, Chikatilo was jeered at by the victims' families, who demanded that he be handed over to them for punishment for the atrocities he had committed against their children and loved ones. Enraged at the gruesome sight, they cried out for his blood, wanting to rip him apart, driven by a desire to see him suffer as their loved ones had suffered. It took Judge Leonid 2 days to read the extensive list of charges against Chikatilo, with each crime being detailed individually. The victims' families were profoundly affected by the confessions of the Butcher of Rostov. The atmosphere in the courtroom was filled with grief and shock as the horrifying details were unveiled. Some family members wept openly, while others were visibly distraught, with some even fainting upon hearing the gruesome methods in which their innocent loved ones had met their end. The courtroom was overwhelmed by a deep sense of tragedy and despair as the full extent of Chikatilo's brutal actions was revealed. After reading the extensive list of charges, Judge Leonid expressed his intention for an open trial, proclaiming, "Let this trial serve as a lesson so that such atrocities may never occur again, anywhere, ever." He then instructed Chikatilo to stand, identify himself, and state his date and place of birth. Chikatilo complied civilly, one of the rare instances during the trial where he appeared to act normally. The trial was as complex as the extensive list of Chikatilo's victims, further complicated by his inappropriate behavior. He often gave vague responses to questions, and frequently recounted the hardships he and his family faced during the Stalinist famine in World War II, attempting to portray himself as a victim. Chikatilo became visibly irritated when the topic of missing genitalia was brought up or when questioned about the victim's belongings. On May 13th, Chikatilo recanted his confession for 6 of the murders he was accused of, and claimed instead to have committed 4 additional murders not included in the indictment. When asked about his lack of concern for the gender of his victims, Chikatilo chillingly replied, "I didn't have to look for victims, they were everywhere I went." Several times, Judge Leonid ordered Chikatilo to be silent, adding, "You are not insane," as Chikatilo attempted to distort the truth and portray himself as a victim, recalling childhood traumas and claiming the charges against him were false. In an effort to appear even more unstable, Chikatilo alleged that his cell was being irradiated. He frequently interrupted the judge, shouting, "Fraud!" On one occasion, Chikatilo stripped naked in his cage and exposed his genitals, suddenly shouting that he was not homosexual. This act seemed calculated to confuse everyone present and give the impression of mental instability. Chikatilo's inappropriate behavior led to his removal from the courtroom multiple times, with the trial proceeding in his absence. Despite his attempts to disrupt the proceedings and manipulate perceptions of his mental state, the court continued to follow its course. Chikatilo's erratic behavior, which included making outlandish claims and engaging in disturbing actions, appeared to be a deliberate attempt to create chaos and delay the proceedings. His outbursts were not just disruptive but also deeply unsettling for everyone present, especially the families of the victims who had already endured so much pain. Chikatilo's actions were seen by many as a final act of cruelty, a way to inflict further suffering on the families and the public by drawing attention away from the horrific nature of his crimes and onto himself. Despite these challenges, Judge Leonid remained resolute, refusing to be swayed by Chikatilo's antics. The court's focus stayed firmly on delivering justice for the victims. Chikatilo's behavior, far from garnering sympathy, only served to underscore his dangerousness and the calculated nature of his crimes. The trial, though marred by these disruptions, proceeded methodically, ensuring that the full extent of Chikatilo's actions was brought to light and that the victims' voices were heard. On April 21st, Chikatilo's defense requested that Dr. Bukhanovsky be allowed to testify about the contents of the 65-page criminal profile he had written in 1985, as well as his subsequent consultation with Chikatilo after the arrest. They argued that Bukhanovsky's testimony could potentially influence the outcome of the trial. However, this request was denied on the same day. Following this decision, Chikatilo stopped responding to questions from the judge, the prosecutor, and even his own defense attorney. For 3 days, he refused to cooperate, stating that the presumption of innocence had been irrevocably violated by the judge. Chikatilo declared his intention to no longer testify, effectively ceasing his participation in the trial. Chikatilo's lawyer, Khabibulin, requested a second psychological evaluation for his client, but Judge Leonid denied the request, calling it baseless. In response, Khabibulin stood up and criticized the court, asserting that the judge was not fit to preside over the case. Chikatilo echoed these sentiments, pointing out several instances where the judge had seemingly jumped to conclusions about his guilt. Prosecutor Nikolai Gerasimenko agreed that the defendant's rights had been compromised, noting that the public nature of the case had already biased the media and public opinion against Chikatilo, making a fair trial challenging. He highlighted multiple occasions where the judge had been unduly harsh on Chikatilo and argued that the defendant's rights had been repeatedly violated, calling for the judge's replacement. However, instead of replacing the judge, Judge Leonid removed Gerasimenko from the case, and the trial continued until Anatoly Zadorozhny was appointed as the new prosecutor. Bukhanovsky was allowed to testify as a witness on July 3rd. He spoke for 3 hours, detailing the psychological profile and the conversations that led to Chikatilo's arrest. 4 experts from the Serbsky Institute also testified about the behavioral analysis conducted on Chikatilo. They concluded that his behavior in the courtroom, which was markedly different from his behavior in his cell, appeared to be calculated attempts to portray himself as insane in hopes of being acquitted on those grounds. On August 9th, Khabibulin presented his closing arguments, starting by expressing his doubt that his voice would be heard above the general outcry for vengeance against Chikatilo. He began by questioning the forensic evidence presented at the trial, suggesting that the confessions made by Chikatilo and the locations he identified were baseless. Khabibulin challenged the objectivity of the judge and criticized the refusal to allow independent psychiatrists to examine Chikatilo. He emphasized that the brutal nature of the crimes suggested they could not have been committed by a sane individual. Khabibulin formally requested the judge to find his client not guilty. The following day, prosecutor Anatoly Zadorozhny argued that Chikatilo was fully guilty of the crimes he committed. He highlighted that Chikatilo was capable of resisting his sick urges to kill when under surveillance and evaded capture by the police. Zadorozhny emphasized that in 19 of the charges, the evidence was provided by Chikatilo himself. He then recited each charge and formally requested the death penalty. As the trial approached its conclusion, Judge Leonid brought Chikatilo back into the courtroom and asked if he had any final statements. Chikatilo remained silent in response. The judge then announced that the verdict would be delivered on September 15th, after he and 2 officials had thoroughly reviewed all the evidence. However, this date was postponed when Ludmila Alexeyeva's brother, in a moment of rage, hurled a heavy piece of metal at Chikatilo's chest. As a result, the final verdict was rescheduled for October 14th. On October 14th, the court convened to deliver the formal sentence.
Окончательное наказание Чикатило на основании статьи 40 Уголовного кодекса Российской Федерации назначить в виде смертной казни. Поднимайте подсудимого. Чикатило, по приговору суда вы приговорены к смертной казни. Вам ясен приговор суда? Ясен. Уводите.
Chikatilo was sentenced to death for each murder he was found guilty of, totaling 52 out of the 53 charges against him, along with 5 counts of sexual assault against students from his time as a teacher. Following the sentencing, Judge Leonid harshly criticized the police and the prosecution, specifically condemning Issa for negligence, as Chikatilo had been overlooked as a suspect in 1987, despite appearing on the suspect list. The final resolution of the case came on October 15th, when the court delivered its verdict, the death penalty. Judge Leonid declared, "Taking into consideration the horrible misdeeds of which he is guilty, this court has no alternative but to impose the only sentence that he deserves. I therefore sentence him to death." Chikatilo attempted to appeal his sentence to the Supreme Court, but it was rejected on January 4, 1994. On February 14, 1994, he was led from his death row cell to a soundproof room in Novocherkassk prison. There, a single bullet fired behind his right ear brought an end to the life of the Rostov butcher. Chikatilo was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Those who are abused often become abusers themselves if they don't find a way out of their suffering. This is why it's crucial to stop abuse wherever it occurs. Otherwise, it tends to escalate and, like a ticking time bomb, eventually explodes. Until next time, stay safe and take care of yourselves. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It helps me a lot.